In 1536, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's first minister and a vicegerent for ecclesiastics, issued injunctions in Henry's names, stating that every parson or proprietary of any parish church within the realm shall, on this side of the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula next coming, the 1st of August, provide a book of the whole Bible, both in Latin and in English. This was a major transformation in the history of the English Bible. For the first time, every parish church was required to buy a Bible in the vernacular as well as in Latin. To answer the demand for these Bibles, Thomas Cromwell instigated the printing of the Great Bible, a very impressive book that survives nowadays in dozens of copies. This was a crucial period in the history of religion and the Bible. However, the analysis of the Bible shows us a book in flux. It reveals that there was no clear trajectory for reform in 16th century England. Cromwell sought to merge Henry's political goals of control over the English church after his break from Rome with his own reformist agenda and evangelical zeal. He knew that in order to convince Henry, he would do well to produce a very impressive book, and the result was staggering. Its materiality is immaculate. Its page size is 37.5 on 25.2 centimeters. Its weight in a 16th century binding is about 6.8 kilograms, which is about the weight of a billiard ball or a terrier. Now, in order to produce such an impressive book, Cromwell had to look beyond England. England at the time did not have paper mills to provide a high-grade paper Cromwell sought, nor a printing press large enough for this kind of exercise. He went to Paris and sought the help of the printer Regnault, who printed English books beforehand. When he was printing that, he printed also 2 presentation copies, which are at the center of our talk today. Whereas standard books of the Bible, standard copies of the Great Bible were printed on paper, these presentation copies were printed on parchment. Every woodcut was carefully painted by leading artists. And these two presentation copies were meant to be sent, as we learn in a letter from Paris to Cromwell, were meant to be sent back to England, 1 copy to Henry and 1 copy to Cromwell. These 2 presentation copies survive nowadays, one in the St. John's College in Cambridge and the other in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. We do not know for certain which copy is which, and we have very little additional information about these copies. We therefore received the Bibles on loan and sought to analyze them using new technologies. The St. John Bible was analyzed in the laboratory at the Fitzwilliam Museum in November 2019, and the National Library of Wales more recently in November-December 2020. This project was truly blue sky thinking. We sought to unpack the process of creation and early modifications of the Bible using different technologies. We did not know what we were going to find, and the results were quite staggering. These projects also have methodological implications for how to combine scientific analysis with a book history exploration of key religious books. And I will now hand you to Paula to explain more about the technologies and the science in our analysis.
Evidence of production methods in these books is actually hidden in plain sight. And what we thought was that we would try and tease it out initially by focusing on the decoration of the books. And we started doing that by simple visual observation, which makes it clear that there are a multitude of artists working on these two volumes. In many cases throughout the books, the same image was clearly painted by a different artist on each of the two presentation copies, as is the case, for example, for this image of Bathsheba. Some cases are less clear, and in yet other cases, an artist is clearly working on both volumes and on the same images in each of the two. If we consider, for example, a woodcut depicting Moses receiving the tablets of the law, which is printed twice in each volume, on folios 29 verso and 36 recto of part 1, and we compare the two images on folio 29 verso, both on the left here, in the St. John's College copy above, and the National Library of Wales copy below, you can clearly see that despite some differences in colour palette, and the fact that the two books have obviously aged differently, with the Wales copy showing more signs of darkening due to degradation of the pigments, the painting style of the two images overall is the same. And the same is true for the two prints on folio 36 recto of the two copies, which we see on the right, which are both, again, quite likely to have been painted by the same artist on both volumes. Observation under magnification with the aid of an optical microscope helps us understand even more about the different artists' style. Some of them, including the artist who painted the image on the left, worked fully in the tradition of manuscript illumination, whereas others, such as the artist who painted the image on the right, deployed a watercolor-like technique, whereby they were only or mainly colouring in the printed image, letting most of the thick-set black printed lines show through and provide outlines in black for their figures. We used additional scientific methods, including a range of spectroscopic techniques, which are based on the optical properties of light of various wavelengths, including visible, infrared, and X-rays, and help us reveal the use of different pigment combinations by different artists. If we stick with the example of the images of Moses, both based on the exact same woodcut, as I said, on two folios of the same volumes, these two different artists employed different green, yellow, and pink or purple pigments and mixtures. These preferences for different pigments are remarkably consistent across both volumes, which supports our hypothesis that in some cases, such as these ones, both artists are working on both volumes, each illustrating the same page in each of them. The use of an optical microscope isn't useful just to get a better sense of painting style. If we look at this title page image, which is on title page 4 of the St. John's College copy of the Bible, and we magnify the heads of two figures we see on this page, both of which supposedly represent Thomas Cromwell, first receiving the Bible from his sovereign in the top register of the page, and then handing the book out to his fellow countrymen in the middle register, we can clearly see, in the magnified images, that the two heads, the two portraits don't really resemble each other very much. We can even start to question whether they do, in fact, represent the same historical figure. One thing that is immediately apparent in both cases is that both of them look like actual portraits meant to resemble someone in particular, rather than stock figures like those that surround them on the page. If we get even closer and we deploy raking light, That is, if we position a light source not directly over the page at a certain distance from it before we take a picture, but rather close to the page and to the side compared to the area we're interested in imaging, we notice edges, raised edges, all around these two portraits. Closer analysis reveals that both portraits are in fact painted on separate pieces of parchment, very skillfully glued onto the page in such a professional way that they've remained undetected, or at least undocumented, until now. Further imaging in transmitted light, which means that a light source is placed behind the page whilst an image is captured, revealed that the portraits were not pasted over pre-existing ones, but rather over blank areas, intentionally left blank. This clearly means that the insertion of these two pasted portraits was not an afterthought, but rather a well-planned act. But who could have planned such a feature of the book, and why? In order to answer these questions, it's worth considering who these two portraits might represent. As we said, supposedly they both represent Thomas Cromwell. If we do compare the portrait in the top register with known likenesses of Cromwell, including the portrait painted by someone in the studio of Hans Holbein only a couple of years before the Great Bible was printed, we can appreciate the resemblance. This presumed portrait of Cromwell in the Great Bible does seem to bear significant resemblance to his known likeness. The second portrait, however, in the middle register, doesn't really look like Holbein's image at all. There is no obvious way to identify this second figure. Based on court politics at the time and the iconography of the portrait, we believe that this could be Richard Rich, Chancellor of the Court of Augmentations and Speaker of the House of Commons. A comparison between Rich's known portrait, which you see on the right, and the pasted face appears to support this hypothesis. Should this be true, the positioning of Rich in a position removed from Henry and directly engaged in the slightly tricky endeavour of empowering the lay readership would demonstrate astute manoeuvring on the part of Cromwell. Rich, if this is him, would be presented as a subordinate to Cromwell, which was not actually the case at the time, and with a very clear evangelical stance, which again was not really the case. Before I hand over to Eyal again, it's worth pointing out that in the first title page, which has the same iconography of the fourth one, both of these portraits are also painted on separate pieces of parchment and pasted onto the page. Once again, this is revealed clearly by close observation in raking light.
We cannot overestimate the importance of this title page and its iconography. As argued by Margaret Aston and Tatiana String, this was a clear and distilled manifestation of the ideology of Henry's attitude to the church, tweaked through Cromwell's appreciation of the Bible. A majestic Henry distributing Bibles at the top of the page with God tucked between him and the upper frame. The Bibles being received, as we see now, by Cromwell and by Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who then distribute them to the laity and the clergy. However, a comparison between the printed title page and the hand-colored one reveals key modifications. One of them we've just seen in replacing the faces of Cromwell and Rich, rejigging the political balance on the page. Another key transformation is the removal of the prison scene. So in the original image, the Bible is distributed and the laity duly shouts, "Vivat Rex" and "Long live the King." Everyone, apart from these three people inside the prison. In the hand-painted one, the prison disappears. We can still see traces of the printed image in the red stocking of the figure here. Instead of the prison, what we see is a group of 3 people who are newly introduced to the page. They are presenting a book. It is likely that these 3 people are actually the producers of the Great Bible, Richard Grafton and Edward Whitchurch, and Anne Wells, Whitchurch's wife at the time. So, for Henry and for Cromwell, there was no reason to depict the prison, but rather a dedication scene presenting the very same book, the Great Bible, to its patron and to the monarch. Another key modification has to do with the woman. The woman was quite generic in the original image, was transformed almost completely in the hand-painted one. She was given distinct headgear, a dress, and importantly, our analysis has revealed that its headgear and necklace are the only gold leaf on the page. Moreover, the dress was made with silver, oxidized since. The combined result would have made a truly staggering image and one of the most prominent features of the title page. But who was that woman? If we compare it to known images, we can see a very strong resemblance between the woman in the title page and known portraits of Jane Seymour made by Hans Holbein a few years earlier. Jane Seymour, recently deceased, was Henry's beloved consort, who gave birth to his only male heir, Prince Edward. So, by transforming the image of the woman into that of Jane Seymour, especially given her proximity to children on the page, the title page was made to appeal specifically to Henry and to enhance the importance of the Great Bible to him. There are other modifications of the title page, and these extend to the other copy of the Great Bible, the other presentation copy preserved in the National Library of Wales. Now, in that presentation copy, we no longer have the original title pages. Instead, we have hand-painted title pages that do not replicate or painted over the printed image. And a comparison with printed title pages reveals key modifications, which adds to the enigma of that book. Because what we see here is that the painter of this title page in the National Library of Wales was influenced by the original title page, the printed one. But we can also see key differences. Some scenes do not match. And this adds to the question and uncertainties regarding that copy of the Great Bible. As I said earlier, we have almost no additional information about the production and reception of these presentation copies. The assumption has been that the title pages from the National Wales copy were incised at an earlier date and replaced later on. We are no longer sure this is the case. A comparison to extant title pages and the analysis of the pigments give rise to the possibility that these might have been done earlier as well. And we believe more work is needed to ascertain the process of production. Other key modifications in the National Library of Wales copy include the removal of sheets and their replacement by handwritten ones. And what we see here, that the verso of this page is a printed one, whereas the recto of this one is a handwritten one, done in careful imitation so as to resemble a printed page. This was often done to the other side of the bifolio of title pages, some incised later and some replaced by blank copies, some by painted ones. And once more, it is unclear when this was done and for what purpose.
So far, we've mostly looked at features of these two copies of the Great Bible, which we believe to be original, pertaining to their story from the time they were first assembled or shortly thereafter. Let me conclude briefly with a couple more interesting discoveries, which may instead reveal something about the book's later lives. In particular, the gutter of the Welsh copy preserves a small nail, slightly the worse for wear due to having spent a few centuries inside a tightly bound book. We haven't yet started looking into its shape, composition, and potential origin, but it's certainly exciting to have found a witness of the book's complex life. And then something else that 21st century science allows us to do is delve into the features of the parchment used to make the books. Again, in the case of the Welsh copy, we have carefully sampled 12 pages, including both printed and handwritten ones, as well as some blank pages, which may have been inserted at a later stage. The analysis of the parchment revealed that they were all made using calf skin. And we're hoping to commission more detailed DNA analysis as part of a future research project on these two volumes, which will hopefully give us some indication of just how similar the pages used in the various parts of the book actually are. We realized that we've only really scratched the surface of what can be said about these two volumes. They're such complex objects that no matter how closely we have investigated them during the past year or so, they still hold innumerable secrets. We are very much hoping to reveal at least some of them through a larger scale research project, which will employ a cross-disciplinary approach and methodology to study these volumes and situate them within the broader context of the Great Bible production and the enriching reform. We look forward to sharing our future discoveries with you, perhaps at a future edition of the RSA conference. Thank you so much for your attention.